God majors in suffering. He redeems the world through suffering. The pathway of our Lord is the Via Dolorosa, the road of grief. It is through suffering that our redemption is accomplished, beloved. God majors in suffering. To say that he has nothing to do with it is to take all hope away from us.
Well, good morning. My name is Brian. Thank you and welcome to Flatiron Church. I'm lead pastor here. And I just got a question. Have you ever had those very bad, no good, long weeks or days where you're just like, let's go ahead and push fast forward on this, or maybe rewind and have it never happen? If you're just joining with us, the series of Job is a lot like that. You're getting a glimpse, a snapshot, if you will, into one of the hardest days of this man's life, and that then really turns into the hardest, potentially, months of this man's life. Last week we looked at the unfolding of Job. He was a righteous man in good standing, loved the Lord, and then quite literally, all hell was against him and broke loose on him as Satan was allowed to take away everything he had except for his life. Well, today, we're going to see the second iteration of this, and what's happening is that Satan's going to come back into the play, and he's going to say, hey, the first test wasn't really done well. We need to administer it different. We need a new set of rules, and I promise if we do this, Job will curse you. And so that's kind of where our text is going, but where it plays for you and I is, you know, as I talked about last week, things can always get worse. Well, sometimes what happens is things get worse in your life, and then people come around and they have a lot of advice on what you should or shouldn't do. Have you ever been there? People, unsolicited advice, they're coming in, they're just like, hey, I see that you're a mess and in misery. Let me add to that with my terrible advice. And they never start off that way, but oftentimes, even the good advice or the seemingly good advice can take you down paths that you don't want to be taken down. 2019, I'm in the midst of a physical crisis, and I've got a lot of people who are saying nice things, well-wishing things. Hey, it's okay, stay in there. I was like, my arm's not working. What's going on here? The doctors didn't know what was happening. And during that time, a lot of people that wanted to speak nicely to me were, you know, they were having conversations, and I was grateful and I was thankful, but it really wasn't moving the ball for me emotionally or spiritually. And fall is my favorite season. Fall is the season I love the most because the two things I like the most come together in the fall: fantasy football and hunting. I like to watch other guys run into each other, and I like to shoot things. Yeah. I mean, truly, though, like the fall is a good time for Brian. I get excited about it. But in 2019, I'm sitting at my wife's parents' house, and I'm getting ready to hunt. And, you know, this is normally a joyous time in the year for me. But I was a mess. I was miserable. I was in a low. And even hunting wasn't taking me out of it. Have you ever been in those seasons? The things you love to do, just somehow I'm not even enjoying it right now. The things I normally found a lot of joy in, I'm just in the midst of grieving. Well, I get on the call with my brother at that point, and I wasn't expecting much. You know, we're going back and forth a couple times, but he starts to share with me a little bit of when he went through a trough, a little bit of when he went through the darkness, a little bit of what we call the dark soul of the night. And as he shared those things, there was nothing profound that was being shared, but what was happening is I felt my heart actually becoming encouraged. And I remember journaling that evening as I heard him share his hardship, as I heard him talk through the things and the difficulties he had gone through, and he had shared how the Lord had met him. It actually began to encourage me. And I learned something very profound that night, that good counsel, wise counsel, doesn't necessarily tell you anything that's new. It reminds you of what is. It reminds you of what is true. And there's something about story. There's something about hearing somebody walk through something that you're going through that prompts your heart to once again trust and faith. The difference between wise counsel and faulty counsel may sound good and may have all the same types of syllables being in there, but it doesn't lead you back to Jesus. It doesn't lead you back to trust. It is empty. Here's where we're going today. Big idea. is that I'd rather have a struggling faith. A struggling faith is better than faulty counsel. But here's the problem. Faulty counsel oftentimes sounds good in the moment. Faulty counsel oftentimes seemingly makes sense, whereas the struggle for faith is more difficult. But that is the path forward versus faulty counsel. When I had that conversation with my brother, it wasn't that he was telling me anything new. He was reminding me once again where to place my faith. Did it change my life in that moment? Did it change the situation and scenario I found myself in? No. But I had a renewed perspective. And some of you, you're coming in today, and what you need is a renewed perspective. You're about tapped out when it comes to relationships. You're about tapped out when it comes to kids. You're about tapped out when it comes to your job. You're about tapped out when it comes to this church. And what I'm going to try to do today is point you, not tell you anything that you haven't heard, but remind you once again what is true. Because a struggling faith is far more valuable than faulty counsel. So here's my question for you. Where are you needing to hold on to faith right now? What area of your life is under attack? What area has been difficult this week? Where were the explosions? Maybe it's acute, it just happened. Maybe they've been ongoing. This is months in the making. What's causing you to fear, to fret, to worry? Picking it up in chapter 2, we're going to be looking in the ESV. I got it on the screen, but get in the habit of bringing your Bibles. It's good to have your own Bible, so that way you can kind of get familiar with it and write in it and do things with it. There's no sin in writing in your Bible. Some people believe that. I'm not sure why. Write in the thing, take the thing, use the thing. It's good. So verse 1, chapter 2, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also among them came. He came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." Okay, real quick. Again, similar, if you were here last week, we opened up how God's taking counsel. He's got a court going on, and you're going to notice that he's got a bunch of the sons of God there, and we're seeing this character, Satan, being introduced, and he's kind of making his way in, and you're going to notice that God's asking the questions, not Satan. Satan's giving the responses. So we see a picture where God's in control, but he's asking Satan, how's it going? And now verse 3. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, a blameless, upright man who fears God. He turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." If you weren't here last week, what God allowed Satan to do, they were having court, and basically Satan said, "I've considered your servant, but if you take away all the things he loves, he'll curse you to your face." That was the premise. That was kind of okay, let's do the test run and see if that works. He does this. Job doesn't curse God to his face. And now God is saying, look, even though you took everything he had, he is still held fast with me. And what did he take? He took donkeys. He took oxen. He took camels. He took his children. He took everything, all the wealth generating that could happen. He took all the loved ones that he had except for his wife. He took everything. Job had everything demolished, and yet he still held fast to God. So that gives us two reasons or two understandings. The first is that Satan doesn't know the future. Did you see that? He said, do this and this will happen. Well, Satan, you took all the things away and this still didn't happen. And sometimes Satan gets in the habit of lying to you, and one of the ways he lies to you is he says, X, Y, and Z is what your future looks like, and you can't change it. The problem is, when we believe that, we're believing a liar who actually doesn't see the future. Whenever I'm counseling people and they're really fearful, they're filled with anxiety, they're dreading life, I always say, focus today, because today is all you've got. You don't know what 2 months from now looks like. You don't know what 6 months from now looks like. And the enemy wants you to envision and imagine a 6-month reality that he can't know. But he'll fill your mind with all sorts of fear and dread, won't he? And what's it going to do? The moment he can get you filled with fear and filled with dread, all of a sudden you're looking for advice. Hey, could you meet me in this? Well, no, the actual answer is don't meet you in this fear and dread that's predicated upon a false assumption. Trust in today that the Lord is near you. Okay, subtle, but that is how our enemy works. The second thing is that Satan puts on him, Satan says, well, the reason it didn't work is because you didn't take everything. Like, that doesn't tell me more about Job. That tells me more about Satan, right? Satan can only think in the selfishness. He cannot think in the selflessness, which means when he's mapping out his game plan, when he's mapping out the world, when he's mapping out how do I move the figures and attack and push, the number one thing he's got is how he thinks. And how he thinks is selfishness. If you take this away, I'm going to respond in kind. If you take this away, I'm going to move against you. He can't imagine a selfless response. So how does he respond? Well, the test was wrong, right? That's what he's saying. He's like, hey, we didn't actually run this. We need to redo the test. There were some faulty assumptions in there. It's like, no, you ran the test. It just didn't work. And that's the third thing we see of Satan. He never owns up to his wrongdoing. Never. There's never a admission of guilt. Okay. Verse 4, let's see what he goes on to say. Satan answers the Lord, skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. Okay, this phrase, skin for skin, it kind of seems a little arbitrary at first. Here's what's happening. In this day and age, and just like it is in our day and age, there's things that happen outside of you, and then there's things that happen to you. Satan is saying, the reason Job didn't actually curse you to your face, God, is because you didn't harm him. You just took all the things around him. Effectively, what he is arguing is that Job is so selfish that he only cares of himself first and foremost, that even though he lost everything, it didn't really hurt him because it wasn't him. Are you catching the argument here? That's the argument Satan is making about Job. And here's what he's doing. He's putting on Job how he would think. He's putting on Job how Satan himself would think. Satan's like, I don't care what happens to anybody. I want the whole thing to burn as long as I get to be king. That's how he thinks. And he's putting that on Job. He's saying, this is the reason Job is still praising you, because you didn't touch his life, touch his health, and it's another story. That's interesting. It's downright demonic if you think about it. Now, there are people in this world that are like that. They just completely don't care. As long as it's not them, they don't care. But for most of us, if we lose our family, we're feeling it. If we lose our family, we lose the people we love the most, we're absolutely feeling it. The second thing we're seeing is he's saying compound the problems, and as you compound problems, then you'll start to get the heart of people. And now there's some truth in this, right? When you're going through difficult seasons and you're losing things, you know what tends to complicate that? Is when your own body starts to become the problem, right? You've got troubles in the home, troubles in the marriage, troubles with the kid, and then you find out, oh, there's a mass on somewhere in your body and we got to take a biopsy of it. Now what's happened? Stress has gone up, the worry and fear has gone up, and all those external problems haven't gone away. They've just become part of the chaos that you're now living in. When you find yourself in those seasons where all of a sudden a lot of things start hitting all at once, take note that if you're in Christ, there's often some purpose that's happening. You may not see it right now, but there's some purpose that's happening. Because why? We're seeing this happen with Job, and there's a purpose God is intending it for him. You're thinking, how can this be good? We'll get there very shortly. But first, let's read more. So Satan, verse 7, he went out from the presence of the Lord. He struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot up to the crown of his head, whole body. And he took a piece, and this is Job, he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself, and he sat in the ashes. Job, everything's gone. Everything's been lost. In this day and age, you'd often have a city and a city wall, and outside of that wall, there was a refuse dump, and this is where they'd throw trash and garbage, and they'd burn it periodically, and so over time, that thing would grow, and they'd start new, and this is why you had mounds. These large mounds are oftentimes just burn pits. Job's sitting out there because he's lost everything, and now that he's physically unclean, he's got these open boils and sores, he's now outside of the city wall, and he is literally scraping the pustules with the broken shards of pottery. I don't care who you are, at this stage, this is what we call struggling faith. Struggling faith. And what do I mean by that? I mean it is a struggle to hold on to it, that God's still good in the midst of it. It's a struggle to hold on to it, that somehow this is okay. When you find yourself in the moment where you're scraping your skin with a pot outside of the city gates and everything you love is lost, it's a struggling faith. And some of you guys are there today. The things that happened throughout this week played out in such a manner that you never expected. Conversations that you were hoping went well went terrible. News that you were hoping was going to be encouraging didn't come. Conversations that you were looking forward to fell apart, and the people you love the most you're distance with. Sometimes you're in those weeks. Sometimes that's exactly what you're waking up to, and sometimes you're coming into church on a Sunday and you got to put on a smile, or at least you think you do, when everything's broken. I've been there. You get those moments, those key moments. All of a sudden you hit that low and you're like, how in the world do I move forward? Now take a look. Because what the author's going to do is he's going to show us what tends to happen. He's going to show us what we tend to do. In those moments when we're at the lowest of the low, that's when we're looking for advice, and that's also when advice is most given, and not all of it's very helpful. That unsolicited advice, that sense of, oh, I see that you're really in pain, so let me help you, but sometimes that helping is actually hurting. Take a look with me, verse 9. It says, then the wife said to him, his wife, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, I went back and looked at the Hebrew. It's the same. It's the same thing, curse God and die. You're like, wow, that sounds super harsh. It is. But before we start blaming the wife, I want to take a look and say that this actually tends to hold true for advice giving. And here's what I mean. It's written in such a way that you could read this from multiple contexts. So the first one we see here is that his wife is saying, do you still hold fast to your integrity? This could be read in such a way where she's saying, look, you clearly screwed up, you did something wrong, own up to it, and just die already. Now that's pretty harsh. Have you ever had harsh counsel in seasons of trial? Somebody ever come up to you and been like, well, really, this is just your fault? It's always super well received. It's like, thank you so much. Grab the pottery piece and start scraping yourself. Been there? Love that. Sometimes we get those people, sometimes we get those seasons where all of a sudden you're in the midst of chaos, and the only encouragement you've got is not really encouragement at all. It's basically, it's your fault, just deal with it. Now that type of counsel, if you will, we often want to reject, and it's like, okay, just move on. But what happens when it comes from family? What happens when it comes from a parent? What happens when it comes from your spouse? It starts to grate on you, doesn't it? It starts to, and maybe sometimes you even begin to believe it. You know, the reason such and such happened is because you. And you start to internalize that, and you start to think that, and you start to live that out. But here's what I love about our author. He writes this in such a way that it actually could mean quite the opposite. Take a look. It says, do you still hold fast your integrity? You could see this from the perspective where she's saying, you're suffering, you're waiting on God, you're doing all the right things. He's not coming. Just get it over with so you can at least have some comfort. And this type of counsel is really tricky, and this is the type of counsel that I think trips up most of us, is it doesn't sound discouraging or accusatory. It actually sounds relieving, doesn't it? You didn't do anything wrong. There's a mean God out there. And if you would just kind of, maybe give up, or maybe just move on in life, and at least you'll get some comfort. This is the whole euthanasia movement that's happening all over, especially Western countries today. It's a big push now to just say, hey, if you're not right with yourself, then we want to give you a peaceful process to end yourself. And now you're seeing 20s and 30-year-olds doing it. And you're like, oh, that's got to be fringe. It was fringe 20 years ago. It's not fringe anymore. And the reason I say that is because both sides of those counsel, they look so different, don't they? The one seems so accusatory, the other seems so gracious. But here's the thing, in the end, they both lead to death. Look with me, verse 9. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. In the end, that faulty counsel, no matter if it sounds loving or not, in its end, faulty counsel leads to death. And that is what makes counsel so important. When you're allowing voices to speak into you, when you're hearing things that maybe you didn't even want to hear, you're not even wanting to solicit it, but it's coming anyways, faulty counsel may sound good and lead to death. It may sound harsh and lead to death. The goodness and the harshness of it are not the bearing of whether or not it's true. Let me say that again. The goodness or the harshness of counsel is not the bearing of whether or not it's true. Faulty counsel often looks good, but it always leads to death. Here's the thing. When Lot's wife is saying this, I don't know her heart. I don't know what side of the aisle she was taking it. I don't think that's important. I think as it's written down for us, it's important for us to see that this is the type of counsel that we receive all the time. And where it's really tricky is when it comes from those that we love the most, when it comes from the family, when it comes from the spouse, when it comes from the parent, when it comes from the brother. Do you realize that sometimes you give and get terrible advice? Sometimes you give it too. Let me go ahead and illustrate a few areas. I'm going to list 5 areas that I see a lot of faulty advice going, a lot of faulty counsel happening, even with people in the church. First one, conflict. There's a lie out there that effectively, basically is positioning fans versus friends. I think I've got that on the screen. Fans versus friends. Somehow we want to have fans with us that tell us everything we want to hear and nothing we don't. And the way this tends to be summed up is, hey, you know something's going to be right when there's no conflict. Well, whoever said that, that's insane. If you have a good board and a good business, you know what's going to happen? Conflict. If you have a good marriage, you know what's going to happen? Conflict. Did you know that? There's going to be moments you're not seeing things clearly. It needs to be pointed out. There's going to be moments she's not seeing things clearly. It needs to be pointed out. Nobody's perfect in this scenario. But we live in a world that's effectively said conflict is wrong. Therefore, we gravitate towards fans, those who see everything we want to see and affirm everything we want to affirm, versus friends. Friends will tell you what you need to hear when you need to hear it. In that moment with my brother, when I was sitting in the depths of my depression, he didn't just come around me and be like, oh, buddy, or he looked at me and he said, hey, there's a path forward, but it's not easy. And I'm going to share with you how God did it in my life. And he didn't beat me up the head, but he also didn't coddle me either. He just, right down the line, this is how God moved. And it stirred within my heart a peace. It stirred within my heart a renewed affection of knowing that no matter what happens, no matter what the diagnosis is, the Lord remains. And that gave a peace. Here's another thing we see. Church, we see this breakout in church, a lot of faulty advice. A lot of times what happens is there's this big excitement, new church, a lot of people are coming, whole new thing, and then you get about 6 months in, and you're starting to think like, I don't know if I like everything. You know what? I kind of don't like everything. I kind of think that guy's an idiot. And all of a sudden it starts to just snowball a little bit. And then you start to take stock and you're like, you know what? I need to find a church made in my image and my likeness, and that's what I need to find. And then you'll always find friends and bloggers online. They're like, it's exactly what you need to do. But did we ever ask the question, what's the witness? I've never said Flatiron's perfect. In fact, I've said emphatically we're not. We're not, including me. I don't like myself half the time. Okay? It's a bother to be around. I'm a perfectionist on dumb things. But I'm asking, do we have a witness that pushes us through to endure? Last week, 17 people met Jesus. Next week, we're having 17 get baptized. Okay? Come on. I have shared my faith on the beaches. I've shared it with coworkers. I've shared it with neighbors. I've never seen 17 people meet Jesus in one time. And you know why? Because what God does in the local church through you and me, he says, only happens in the local church. Which means, how do we put preference aside for mission? Which means, it doesn't mean, hey, just ignore everything and just endure. It does mean, is mission what's driving you to move in or move out of a church? If it's wants, that's where I'd say, Pause. Now here's the other thing. We're not going to be the church for everybody. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people coming in and saying, you know what? I think I'd fit better here and here and here. What I don't want to see, though, is I think I'd fit better here because it'd make me more comfortable. Wherever you go, let it continue to push you on mission. Okay? And I mean that. There are good reasons to leave. I'm not against that. And I don't need to make enemies of people that do. I'm kingdom as far as he's going to use a lot of churches and a lot of different type of churches. Come on, let's go. Singleness. You're like, singles, well, I'm not picking on them, but I do need to talk with you guys because it's increasing. We have Gen Z, the largest cohort of singles that the United States has ever seen. In fact, within the next 20 years, they're saying, estimate roughly, that 50% of Gen Z males will not get married, and over 50% of Gen Z males will not have kids. We have never seen anything like this in the United States history, and truth be told, we're seeing it all around the Western world. People just simply opting out of marriage, people simply opting out of kind of having those ties with each other. And what tends to happen is you go girl, you go guy, you do you, YOLO, you only live once, enjoy life. Why would you want to shackle it in this institution? And I'm looking at them and I'm like, here's the problem I see is self versus serving. This mindset of, is my life about me or is my life about serving others? Is my life about my pursuits or is my life about, Lord, what do you want to do with me? And here's the biggest issue I have. It's not that I'm saying you got to be married to follow Jesus. What I am saying is if you're shacking around, sleeping with whoever you want, and then coming in saying, I think God may be single, I'm looking at you saying, you're the bozo clown. You're foolish. He clearly is not. If you've got the gift of celibacy, you know what you're not doing? Hooking up with people. Okay? So if you're coming in and that's what's happening, then my direction to you is repent, meet Jesus, and actually turn those towards something good, like getting married. But the first thing is, as I would say, stop doing what you're doing and start following Jesus. Your life and your body is a temple. And you're thinking, well, I can just kind of stuff a whole bunch of things in that temple and I'll be fine. No, there's consequences to sin. Sin always leads to death. So the moment you start putting that in you, guess what's going to happen? Death is coming out of you. And you're thinking, oh, that's just crazy talk. Guys, I have friends in their 30s, late 30s, they made a master class of playing the game at bars and sit-down clubs. And you know what happens? Is now they're in their late 30s, they can't find a wife because they can't stop themselves from chasing after girls. And they're enslaved to it. Because here's the thing, when you start to allow your sin to lead you, it will lead you. And it will put its hooks in you and it will own you. And when you try to get out of it, you can't. The wages of sin is death. So what I'd like to do with our young men and I'd like to do with our young women is I'd like for you to first and foremost say, your life is not your own if you're in Jesus. It's his. And the second thing is, what does he want you to do with it? Have a good time or a good legacy? And then the third thing is, we are extraordinarily selfish beings. And one of the greatest ways I've seen selfishness get knocked out is when you have to go around another selfish person. And somewhere in that friction, oh, God does some good work. Oh, man. Oh, man. You look at Brian without Melinda, I wouldn't be up here. I'd be a mess. I was on the verge of just, does this guy even make sense? And the Lord in his grace said, I'm going to give you another sinner because she's not perfect. But her sins are different than my sins. Her particularities are different than my particularities. If you ever met Melinda and I, we are two polar opposite people. And we don't make sense at all, on paper or any other way. And the Lord, in his grace and mercy, put us together. And it's changed me. So let me speak to the married right now. Happiness versus holiness. Some of you guys are sitting in your marriage right now, and you're like, I think I just need to get out because I'm not happy. The butterflies are gone. And I'm like, welcome to marriage, man. The butterflies last a second. You're not jarring those things back up and putting them back in. They're gone. And now that allows you to do the real work of how do I choose to love that person that the Lord has given me. Now, some of you guys are in marriages where truly there is abuse, there's misuse, there's neglect. And I sit down from those couples, and I sit down. Normally it's not the couple because only one's coming. And I process that very differently. There are seasons where separation's permissible. There's definitely seasons where divorce is permissible by the Lord's mouth himself. If infidelity's in the mix, if there's spousal abuse in the mix, we handle those situations different. But a lot of what I see churning within the people's minds isn't so much that. It's I no longer feel fulfilled. I've fallen out of love. I think I want to add another partner in this mix of people. Like, that is all messed up. But let's go ahead and sit down. Let's have a conversation. And normally what I'm going to do is I'm going to point them back to what Paul said marriage was meant to be, which was to image Christ and the church. And it's a profound mystery. There's something miraculous happening when our marriages are imaging that, because what it's doing is it's showing the world something that the world can't make sense of. Christ gave his life, lived the perfect life. He died. What's happening here is he is living in such a manner as he is laying down his life, and that's what husbands are called to do. Lay down your life, to lead your families, to lead both spiritually, so that it's not just her taking the kids, doing the things, she's more spiritual than I am. Then change that now. Repent and change. He needs you to lead in that family to point back to who Jesus is and to fight the enemy that's going to lie to her and lie to your kids and stand in the gap when all of a sudden you're seeing things go wrong and you're saying, you know what? No, here's the path we need to go down because this is the path of Jesus. And ladies, here's the other problem, though, is that you're supposed to represent the church response in this, and the church response is no easier. It's how do I respect that? How do I submit to that when I don't necessarily trust everything he's doing? Because a guy, especially if he's not leading like Christ, it's really hard to follow him. And so here's where that dance starts to get off, and all of a sudden you're like, well, we're not operating the way we should. And the problem is you just can't continue like that. It's not like you're just going to stay in stasis. Your marriage is either increasing or it's going down. And so what I say in those couples is I say, get around healthy couples and see how they do it. Get around healthier couples and see how they're living. Start to open up your life and your marriage to other people, not in a sexual way by any means, but in a way of saying, hey, we laugh about this. Guys, we're living in crazy times right now. Absolute insanity. The amount of people I have saying things that they're doing, I'm like, I didn't even think about this. I didn't even thought there was a possibility. And they're coming in and those are the sins they're bearing. I'm like, well, guess what? The gospel can meet that too. Jesus can meet that too. And then he's going to rebuke it and move you forward. But this is where we have to not be, coy about these things. We have to be very honest about these things. Satan wants your marriage to die. And if he can't kill the marriage, then he wants it to be so crippled and unproductive that it's effectively like it's an unmarriage. Okay, lastly, I need to do a series on marriage and singleness. That's where this is going. Finances. You're like, okay, there it is. Pastor's talking about money again. I never talk about money. I rarely talk about this. But here's the thing, gratification versus giving. As I was bringing in some of the young guys and we were talking about this money, a lot of people just kind of think their money is their money. It's mine. I'm going to use it the way I want, so I'm going to spend it on what I want. I'm not going to invest it on what I want. And the idea that they would give to a church is so, I've never thought about that. And especially the young generation, that doesn't even come on the radar. Here's the thing, the Lord, the way that we understand his word is that he has given all good gifts, including your income. You're like, no, I worked for that. My two hands, my brain cells put that together. Who gave you the hands and the brain cells? And who's given you the favor and the blessing? And who controls you and who actually owns it and who's going to be able to move through those hard times and good times? It's all the Lord. And so what do? We give out of the abundance of that. We got out of blessing of that. We get out of trust in that. We give and say, you know what, Lord? Not my will, but your will be done. Here's the thing, church. We're living at a time, a crux right now, where if we don't plan ahead for the future, if we don't give generously and consistently, and I'm talking, get consistent with it. Put your bank check on there and start getting it automatically withdrawn. Some of you guys are just tipping when you want. Tithe consistently. Because here's what's going to happen. If we don't do this as a church, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, all this land is built up. You're going to have tens of thousands of homes, hundreds of thousands of people, and no standalone churches. You're thinking, well, God doesn't need standalone churches. No, he doesn't. But you know what he also values? Prudence in thinking through and planning for the future. And giving your kids, think about this. Okay, I'll talk to the skeptical dad. What do you want your kids to have? A better life than you did. And if you don't, it's because you're perverse. You want them to have a better life than you. What does that mean? It means you're going to prepare. You're going to work hard. You're going to try to get them to succeed and move ahead. And that means you're going to financially give things and hopefully leverage things that you don't want their character to be reduced, but you want to come alongside and be wind in their sails. Well, that's what the church is if we're thinking forward. Because there's going to come a time where we can't meet in schools. And I'll tell you why. My buddies that are planting in cities, they already experienced this. If they won't sign off the dot that they're accepting of everything, guess what? They can't rent the building. And so what ends up happening is Bible-believing, gospel-centered churches can't rent from public buildings because they won't sign off that they say we affirm everything. And now you're meeting in a house. And you're thinking, well, house churches can work. Yeah, house churches can work, and they'll reach a handful of people. But if we're wanting to leave a legacy for people to meet Jesus into the future, you know what's really helpful? Land, buildings, places where you can get large congregations to move and meet. And what does that take? It takes faith, not thinking about the gratification of today, but thinking of the future for tomorrow. And here's what I think trips up most people. And it trips up me if I'm being honest with it. It's like, yeah, but doesn't money ruin all good things? Doesn't it? And I think to myself, it does. If your heart is unchecked. But the issue is not the money, the issue is always the heart. And so what we want to do in that act of giving is actually allow our hearts to be pricked a little to say, not my will, but your will be done. Not my will, but your will be done. Here are 5 common areas that I see faulty counsel making its way even within the church. Faulty counsel. And you don't think of it as sounding just as crazy as what Lot's wife said, but verse 9, let's go back up to that. It says, then his wife said, do you hold fast to your integrity, curse God, die? You're like, I'm not believing any of those kind of lies. That's not the advice I'm living. And I'm like, here's the thing though. It may not sound as preposterous as this. It may not. But go to verse 5 now. Add verse 5 to this. Now take a look. He says, stretch out your hand, touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. Do you see verse 5, voice of Satan, and then do you see verse 9? What's similar? Curse God and die. What does Satan say? Curse God or curse you to your face. Faulty counsel isn't just wrong, it serves the enemy. Faulty counsel isn't just wrong, it's the voice of the enemy. When you and I, in conflict, in church, in singleness, in marriage, in finances, when we invite and listen, or don't even invite, but listen to faulty counsel, it's not serving, it's not neutral, it's serving the enemy. There's no neutral counsel out there. And I think that's part of the thing. We just think, well, there's good, there's bad, and then there's somewhere in between. There's nowhere in between. It's either true because it's of God, or it's not and it's of our enemy. Faulty counsel is not harmless. And when we allow it to leak into our head and our heart or come out of our mouths, we are serving to help the enemy. In that moment, I guarantee you, Lot's wife was not thinking she is parroting Satan's words. But she was. Struggling faith, here's the big idea again. Struggling faith is better than faulty counsel. Struggling faith is a much harder place to stay. Faulty counsel at least gives you some inclination of where to go, some inclination of what to do, some inclination when you're battered about in life to say, okay, well, I guess I'll go that direction. Struggling faith, it just leaves you as is. But here's the thing. Struggling faith is so much better than faulty counsel. Let me go ahead and show you. Verse 10. But Job said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this, Job did not sin with his lips. What's happening here? Job is looking at her, and he's actually being compassionate. He doesn't say, you're a foolish woman. He says, you're speaking like a foolish woman. But he says, shall we receive good, and shall we not receive evil? Here's the line. Job trusts that in all things, God still has a plan. In all things. Heck yeah, you can clap for that. God trusts that in all things, Job trusts that in all things, God still has a plan. I just lost my job, God still has a plan. My marriage is crumbling, God still has a plan. Just had a massive fight with someone I love, God still has a plan. Kids seemingly going off doing their own thing, God still has a plan. God still has a plan in the difficulty. And the world wants to tell you, well, the difficulty is your fault, or no, you should, this world's so cruel. It's like, no, God has a plan. But here's the problem that you and I have to understand. His plan does not take away our pain. It meets us in our pain. It can bring hope in our pain. But we still have to go through it. And I wish, brother and sister, I wish I could stand up and say, nah, all the pain's gone, whatever. Hanging out, living life. But I'd be lying to you. But I don't know how to say this any other way, but somehow going through the pain with Jesus is still better. Somehow going through the pain with Jesus is still better. And I've seen it in my own life, and I think that's the thing that just prompts me to say, lean in. Job, he lost everything, guys. Covered head to toe in sores, pus filled. He's literally scraping it with jagged bits of pottery. He's in the suffering faith and the struggling faith. And you know what he's doing, though? But I know God has a plan. Here's the thing, though. Without Jesus, none of this works. Without Jesus, suffering is just suffering. And I'm not saying there's no earthly good from a person that endures it well versus not. There's a blessing conferred when somebody endures suffering well versus not. But I'm saying without Jesus, there's no weaving out the narrative, taking good that was meant for bad and turning it to good. And so I want to go to Colossians 3 now, because Colossians 3 gives you a snapshot of the heart of Jesus and what that heart looks like in us. And it gives us a good framework to say, how am I doing? How am I handling? What's leaking out of me when things erupt? Verse 12, it says this, chapter 3, Colossians. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. Oh, there's a 4-letter word. Patience. Yeah. Whew. Bearing with one another. Yeah, don't like that. And if anyone has complained against one another, forgiving each other. Don't like that. As the Lord's forgiven you, so you should forgive. Oh, wait. No. It doesn't say that. It says you can forgive. It doesn't say that. Just on any day you'd like, you can forgive. No, it says you must forgive. You must. You must. You're like, there's got to be a typo somewhere in here. No. New Testament Greek checks out. Must is the word. And above all these, and this is what binds it all, is love. You put on love. And verse 15, let this sit on you guys, and let the peace of Christ rule. You know what rule isn't? Rule isn't just counsel. Rule is, it's leading. When you find yourselves in the midst of those absolute insane things and the counsel is coming at you fast, sometimes from the ones you love, sometimes from those closest to you, you say, what's ruling my heart today is the peace of Christ. I know he has a plan. And I know he's going to see me through. Let it rule over you. A struggling faith is still better than faulty counsel. Some of you are in here and you're like, my faith is like super struggling. Can he even work with that? Yeah, he can. Some of you guys are like, I think I might be the bad advice giver, the faulty advisor. Here's the cool thing. You know Lot, when he said, you speak of, he didn't say you are. When he looked at his wife, he didn't say, you are a foolish, he said, you sound like one of the foolish women, which tells me there was times where she gave great advice. There's times where she was a wise sounding board for him. There's times where she was able to kind of say encouraging and helpful things. And what does that mean for you and me? That means, as long as I don't trip on myself, that means there's going to be times where you go from being a good counselor to being a bad counselor. So we all have humility. There's no course you take to all of a sudden, well, now I'm a good counselor status. I never say anything bad. No, you and I have to lead out in humility, because there's going to be moments where we lean in and what comes out of us is pushing people back to the Word. There's going to be other times that what we lead out of is not pushing people back to the Word, but it's pushing them to our fear. So we have humility. But I love this. Struggling faith is still better. When you find yourself and you're like, I'm at the end of holding on, and I don't have strength, I'm going to say, and this sounds weird, welcome. That's usually when you find His. You're like, but that doesn't change my life. No, it doesn't. It changes the way you live your life. But it doesn't take away the pain. It doesn't bring those relationships back. It doesn't allow me to have close proximity to those I love. Sometimes no. And there's a mourning that happens within that. And I can't tell you, as I couldn't tell you last week, why God allows certain things to happen. What I know is that He does. And what I know is that He purposes it for His good, if we're willing to trust. What the enemy most wants more than anything else, he just wants you to not trust him. The enemy wants you to not trust God. He wants you to believe He's not actually good. But when you come back and you say, yeah, I don't know, but I know that He is, the enemy is furious. Because what can he do with you other than turn up the heat more? And you're like, well, I'd rather if He didn't, if we're just being fully honest. Just stop with the burners, Satan. Yeah, I get it. There's moments where I'm like, if I wasn't pushing in, could I just maybe have 1 or 2 burners on, not 10? But the problem with that is, I just don't think the Holy Spirit allows it in you. I think when you follow Him, you kind of just are like, well, where else do I go? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give us a chance to respond to Jesus, because again, if you don't know Jesus, there's no way through this. And I'm going to give us the chance, if you do know Jesus, to once again lay it down before Him. Where's the things that you're believing? Where's the faulty counsel that's come into your heart? And where's the areas you just need to say, okay, God, I need to trust You. So let's go ahead and we'll pray, and then we'll move into our challenges. Father, I thank You for today. I thank You for the work that You're doing, and I thank You that by Your grace You are using Job, a text from thousands of years ago, to speak mightily into our hearts today. Lord, I want to lift up those who are far from You. They don't know You. They're not close to You. They don't acknowledge You as King and Lord. That by Your grace today, they would come to the end of themselves. They would come to the end of trying to be enough, of trying to be righteous on their own strength, of trying to be good enough, of trying to do life according to themselves, and start right now, by faith, to believe that You are who You said You were. That You are King, ruling and reigning in the heavens. You came down as a helpless babe. You lived the life we couldn't live. You died the death that we deserve. Death couldn't hold You. You rose 3 days later. And from this point forward, for those who believe and call out in Your name, they are renewed, they're restored, they're made right with God. And I pray that men and women right now would put down their self-righteousness, would put down their self-effort, would put down all the things they're trying to do to make themselves good enough, and they would simply trust in You. And that You would answer that, you would fill them with Your Spirit, that You would give them a renewed hope, that You'd give them a peace that rules, literally rules over them. So as they make their way into this life and move forward, they're trusting not in their own strength, but in Yours. And Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters here who are just struggling under the weight of sin, struggling under the weight of maybe not even their own sin, but the sin that's being done against them. There's struggles, there's trials, there's fires in their home. Would You once again allow them to cry out and confess where maybe faulty counsel has taken over? To renew and restore, that they have a great high priest, a great king who understands them and moves forward. that they would trust that you have a plan even in this. And I ask this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.